We have been taught our whole lives that the great fires of the 19th century were accidents, that somewhere a kerosene lamp overturned, somewhere imperfect materials ignited from an ordinary spark. But you were deceived. Because if one discards the propaganda sheen of school textbooks, it becomes clear. The flames in these cities operated too selectively. They seemed not to destroy chaotically, but burned out precisely what did not fit into the new worldview. And the deeper I delved into the archives, the more persistently the question arose. What exactly needed to be erased from the face of the earth before history could be rewritten? Look at the photographs taken immediately after those catastrophes. Stone buildings with massive arches and windows as tall as a 3-story house stand almost untouched, while all around is a deserted plain of burned-out blocks. Is it not strange that fire, according to the official version, moved at the speed of a storm, yet bypassed heavy structures as if it understood they were not so easy to topple? For some reason, precisely those buildings that resembled architecture much more ancient than historians claimed were later declared dilapidated and almost immediately demolished. What did these walls conceal? And who could have built such structures if in the 19th century, according to experts, the population of many regions barely reached several 100,000 people? In the archives, I found a description of an inventory conducted immediately after one of the largest fires. The document stated that almost 2/3 of the city had burned down, although satellite reconstruction, yes, such models exist today, shows that the affected area is larger than official reports indicate. Why are the real scales understated? And why do modern researchers avoid discussing the discrepancy, which is equivalent to the difference between an ordinary catastrophe and something akin to a targeted cleanup? Look at the development maps. Many areas after the fire appeared perfectly flat, as if the ground had been prepared in advance. Fire spreads chaotically, but the perfect geometry of a burned-out space. That is an entirely different story. And by the way, pay attention to how long it took cities to recover. Only a few years. However, according to official statistics, during that period these regions lacked both manpower, materials, and equipment. How then were dozens of buildings erected with monolithic columns, intricately shaped ceilings, and facades requiring the work of highly skilled craftsmen? The explanation like, "That's how they built back then," stops working when you see census data. In some cities, the number of inhabitants doubled immediately after the fire, although no mass migrations were recorded during this period. Where did these people come from? And why are the documents for registering newcomers filed in the archives later than they should be? No matter how much I studied reports, diagrams, maps, and rare surviving eyewitness accounts, the entire picture boils down to one thing. The official version does not withstand elementary logic. Timelines do not match, work volumes do not add up. The origin of buildings that, by happy coincidence, survived until they could be demolished without a fire, under the guise of modernization, is not explained. But most importantly, these fires for some reason occurred where the most complex, most monumental structures of the so-called old type stood. They disappeared first. The flames seemed to burn out not streets, but the memory of what existed before us. And when I began to compare the dates of these events, a frightening pattern emerged. Almost every few decades, a major catastrophe occurred, destroying traces of a civilization whose architecture was too advanced for the conditions of the 19th century, too perfect to have been built by people with limited technologies and meager resources. And while historians speak of coincidences, I see something entirely different, a plan that was executed meticulously, consistently, and strikingly effectively. If this is a coincidence, then it is too perfect. If it is an accident, then it is too advantageous for those who rewrote history. When one begins to view the great fires of the 19th century not as natural disasters, but as part of a large historical mechanism, many details suddenly begin to acquire frightening clarity. For example, take the descriptions of temperatures that supposedly reached buildings during the catastrophes. Reports speak of heat that melted metal structures and shattered windows in a matter of minutes. But the official temperature of a city fire never rises above the point at which stone and metal begin to deform. To achieve such effects, heat comparable to the intensity of an industrial furnace is required. Where could it have come from in blocks built with wooden houses, with minimal volumes of fuel? Historians usually bypass this question, but it is too loud to be ignored. I found archival descriptions from eyewitnesses who claimed that the fire moved not like an ordinary flame. It didn't just spread with the wind, but seemed to follow a specific line. There is a firefighter's testimony that is particularly unsettling. He wrote that the street they were moving along was already burned to an even layer of ash, even though just a few hours earlier, stone houses had stood there. Stone houses, he emphasized, could not have burned down so quickly and so uniformly. If only one person had written this, it could be attributed to an emotional outburst. But there are dozens of such testimonies. There are too many of them to speak of coincidence. Let's turn to statistics. In one of the most affected cities, the proportion of stone buildings was approximately 1/5 of all construction. However, after the fire, only about 1/10 of that portion remained. How to explain that a material resistant to fire disappeared almost at the same rate as wood? In reports, this anomaly is attempted to be attributed to explosions allegedly occurring in basements. But when one studies the building plans, it becomes clear that many houses simply did not have spaces in which large volumes of flammable materials could be stored. Instead, almost all these houses had thick walls, arched passageways, and foundations extending deeper into the ground than the building codes of the time required. Why was it necessary for an ordinary city building to create a foundation comparable to those used in fortresses or industrial structures? And now look at the utility maps. Before many fires, infrastructure modernization operations were carried out in cities. This manifested in the removal of some old pipelines, the elimination of unknown underground passages, and the blocking off of several basement levels. What are today called engineering levels were once ordinary underground floors, but official history asserts that these floors were incomplete or naturally filled in. However, photographs of exposed utility lines show carefully leveled walls, tool marks, and even sections of cladding. How could a natural process create such precise architecture? When one looks at all this in conjunction, it becomes clear that the fire is the final stage of an operation. First, a cleanup was conducted beneath the city, then old structures were destroyed, and then the rewriting of history began. And those who asked too many questions were sent to committees, commissions, and institutions, where they were gently but persistently explained that their observations do not fit into academic methodology. But it was precisely this methodology that was created after the old world disappeared. It was a tool that helped construct a new narrative, convenient and understandable, devoid of explosive questions. The most interesting thing is the reaction of the authorities after the fires. They acted too quickly and too organized. Literally within a few weeks, planning for new development began, although resources were scarce and the population was disoriented. Yet the new projects looked as if they had been created long before the catastrophe. Too logical, too well thought out, too convenient for control. Wide streets, symmetrical blocks, administrative buildings constructed in a style that would later be called imperial emerged, and traces of the old world disappeared, sometimes literally overnight. And here is the main question that brings us back to the starting point. Who benefited from burning the evidence? Who had the resources, power, and technology to carry out such operations across vast territories? And why do all these catastrophes strangely coincide with the beginning of the period that historians call the Industrial Era? Or perhaps the Industrial Era is not a beginning, but a reboot. Imagine, In the mid-19th century, across vast expanses of Eurasia and North America, stood architecture that in no way fit the technological level of its time. Monumental facades, colonnades as tall as a 5-story building, tunnels extending deeper into the ground than the building regulations of the era permitted. And suddenly, within just a few decades, waves of fires swept through these cities, each one like the final stage of a large-scale cleanup operation. The official version speaks of tragic coincidences, but look at the mathematics. The probability that such events occurred in several major cities consecutively within a span of just a few decades approaches 0. And the more one looks at these statistics, the stronger the feeling that fire was not an enemy, but a tool. But the most incredible thing begins not before, but after the fires. In one of the cities, I studied a census taken just 3 years after the catastrophe. And this is what shocked me. The population grew by almost 1.5 times, even though migration reports indicated only a few thousand arrivals. How is this possible? Even with an incredibly high birth rate, such a jump is impossible. Either the censuses were rewritten, or people were brought in an organized, massive manner by pre-prepared transport convoys. But where are the documents? Where are the accounting ledgers? Where are the traces of all this logistics? They are gone. As if someone wanted this period of history to be unnoticeable, a void, empty. It is precisely in this void that the key question arises. If people were indeed brought in, then for what purpose? To populate territories from which traces of a past civilization had just disappeared? To form a new population that had never seen what stood here before? To create a generation with neither knowledge nor memories of former technologies? A century is a long enough period to erase memory, but not long enough to erase stone walls. Therefore, the walls had to be burned. Look at the photographs after the fires. In many places, vast deserts of leveled earth remain, without a single stone block. But stone does not simply disappear. If it is not sawn, not removed, not hidden, it remains in place. And yet it disappears, as if entire structures simply dissolved. But if we accept that demolition operations had already been carried out before the fire, everything falls into place. The fire did not destroy buildings. The fire destroyed traces of demolition. It was a smokescreen, concealing a much more subtle, engineeringly complex work. I found a report from one commission, created immediately after the city's reconstruction. It stated that a number of old structures do not meet modern requirements and are subject to urgent demolition. But the strangest thing, the commission indicates the exact number of buildings that were supposedly to be dismantled. The problem is that many of these buildings no longer existed after the fire. That is, the list was compiled in advance. And if such lists existed in one city, how likely is it that they didn't exist in others too? Now imagine one more detail. In several cities, there is evidence that the fire spread faster than physically possible. In one instance, the distance between 2 blocks was approximately 1 kilometer. Between the foci of ignition, mere minutes. The official explanation: strong wind. But even with very strong wind, flames need time to engulf dense construction. And what if the flames erupted simultaneously in several places? What if it was a series of targeted arsons, carried out in an organized manner? Moreover, arsons aimed at specific types of structures, the strangest, the oldest, the most inconvenient for the new version of the past. And here is the culmination. When one looks at these cities before and after the fires, the feeling arises that the world experienced not destruction, but a reboot. As if the old era did not end by itself, but was brought to an end by someone who decided to erase the past and start everything from a clean slate. People, like a new population. The city, like a new stage. History, like a new book. But if the world was indeed being rebooted, then who pressed the button? When I first compared the dates of several of the largest fires, their chronology struck me. Across different points of the planet, from North American cities to territories stretching between the Baltic and Black Seas, the strikes came almost in waves. The intervals between them seemed precisely calculated, on average about 10 to 15 years, as if someone was conducting a large-scale operation across regions, unhurriedly but consistently, as if stripping away the top layers of an undesirable past. Official history explains this period with the underdevelopment of firefighting technologies, but this sounds strange when one sees that the catastrophes occurred not chaotically, but strikingly rhythmically. Now imagine, in the cities already stands architecture of a previous era, too perfect, too massive, too technologically advanced for the level of development that historians attribute to the mid-19th century. And nearby, a young industrial era, only just gaining momentum. The old system, fictional or real, becomes inconvenient. It needs to be hidden because it does not fit into the new ideological framework. A cleanup begins. But here's the strangeness. Fire does not destroy everything indiscriminately. It burns out precisely those areas where architectural anomalies are concentrated, those buildings that went beyond the scope of ordinary construction technology, those structures for which later no one could provide a logical explanation, neither regarding the time of construction, nor the labor resources, nor the materials. In several archives, I came across descriptions of so-called foci of unusual intensity. These are places where the flames seemed to burst forth from within, rather than spreading from the outside. And here it is important to emphasize, this is an artistic image, but it is based on real quotes from eyewitnesses who pointed to explosions, flashes, instant collapse of load-bearing columns. What does this resemble? Not a natural fire, but something more precise, controllable. As if the goal was not to burn down the city, but to destroy certain technologies hidden inside buildings whose layout was far from simple. But where did these technologies disappear? Where are the traces of tools, diagrams, blueprints? Why was not a single artifact found in the rebuilt cities that would attest to the high technical level of the past? And here a detail emerges that is difficult to ignore. In almost every city affected by such fires, within a couple of years after reconstruction, archival depositories were created, where documents found during clearance flowed. But almost all these documents, surprisingly, date to the period after the catastrophe, as if the former paper memory of the world was replaced by a new one. And here appears one of the greatest paradoxes. How could such cities arise immediately after the fires? Within a few years, administrative buildings, railway stations, theaters, schools sprang up, all built in a uniform style, as if the same management stood behind them. This resembles a situation where the old system is destroyed, and a new, simplified one is erected in its place, adapted for the future industrial era. The city became a factory, the population, a workforce, and history, a tool, standardized like an arithmetic textbook. But there is another detail that made me look at everything from a different angle. In several cities after the fires, areas of land were found where traces of structures went deep into the ground for the height of entire floors, 5 to 7 meters below the current level. Officially, this is called accumulation of cultural layer, or natural ground uplift. But these explanations strangely coincide with what happened before the fires. Many basement levels were filled in advance, as if the old floors were meant to disappear from view even before the city burned down. Everything together forms one frighteningly coherent line. Cleanup of underground levels, dismantling of individual building elements, removal of materials, then fire, erasing all traces of preparation, and finally, rapid development according to new rules. As if someone did not want to destroy the cities, They wanted to destroy the past that these cities held. And here is the main question, which grows louder. If the fire was not an accident, but the final touch of an operation, then what exactly were they trying to conceal? What knowledge? What devices? What evidence that our civilization is not the first and perhaps not the most developed? And if this is so, it means the Great Fires were not an end, but a beginning. The beginning of a new era, created as a reassembled world where memory is reformatted and history is rewritten. So let's imagine the final picture. The 19th century approaches its midpoint, and the old world seems to begin to fray at the seams. Monumental buildings, rooted in a deeper era, cease to fit into the new reality. The industrial era is preparing to begin, but it cannot start while structures stand on the streets that seem to have been created by people who possessed different construction principles. The technologies of the old world, real or supposed, hinder the new era from becoming self-sufficient. And that's when what we today call the Great Fires are launched. But here's the crucial point. If everything happened exactly as it appears in the reconstruction, what precisely did they want to erase? What knowledge could change our understanding of the past? In several reports compiled after the catastrophes, there is mention of strange metal structures found under the rubble of buildings that were officially considered stone. These descriptions are extremely brief, almost fragmented, as if the authors were afraid to say more than aloud. They mention stiffening ribs, some unknown alloys, details that defy study. And all of this disappears almost immediately. There are no photographs, no samples, as if this part of memory was meticulously cleaned up. And even if, within a fictional scenario, we imagine these could have been fragments of a previous civilization's technologies, the strangeness of the disappearance of such findings in itself is reason to ponder. Another important detail, the demographic surges that occurred immediately after the fires. Imagine a city that has lost a significant part of its infrastructure and population, and suddenly, just a few years later, it is filled with new people, as if they were purposefully directed to the cleared territory. In the fictional version, this looks like the process of populating a new page of history. But even when considering everything in the context of real data, the question remains, why are migration flows poorly documented and their sources often not indicated? It feels as if the population was supposed to appear, but not arrive, as if a new world was being created not only architecturally, but also socially. Now imagine the philosophical level of the entire picture. If the world truly experienced something akin to a reboot, at least in an allegorical sense, then we live on the surface of a layer beneath which lies another history, forgotten, burned away, or simply not included in the school curriculum. And it is then that the Great Fires become not tragedies, but turning points, lines separating the old order from the new, as boundaries between a reality that we can confirm with documents and a reality that we can only reconstruct. And if one thinks deeper, a frightening yet captivating thought arises. Perhaps our civilization is indeed not the first, but simply the one that exists after a major cleanup. Perhaps we are a generation that was given a new textbook, neatly bound and purged of unnecessary chapters. History seems to become a giant whose memory was cut off, so that it could learn to walk anew. But if so, a question arises before us that cannot be ignored. What will happen when memory begins to return? When more and more people ask uncomfortable questions, when archives become more accessible, when analysis technologies allow us to look into the oldest layers of cities. What will happen if it turns out that we stand on the foundation of a reality about which we know almost nothing? This thought then becomes the final bombshell. The Great Fires of the 19th century, in a fictional reconstruction, look like a global attempt to erase the old world and write a new one. But if our world was once already rewritten, then why not assume that it could happen again? And who then will be those who decide that it's time to press the reboot button? Anyone who asks such questions already goes beyond the customary narrative. And if you have listened to these lines, it means you are one of those who are ready to look deeper than the official version allows. Share your thoughts, subscribe, because we will continue this investigation further. And perhaps together we can understand the most important thing: who stands behind those pages of history that were burned before we had a chance to read them.